Well, hello and welcome. And I'm Peter Kerridge from Premier Christian Radio. And Premier Christian Communications is really glad to be sponsoring this roundtable. And it's all about the online safety bill and the age verification controls that we think are needed to protect children from accessing pornography online. And on this very important day, which, as you might know, is Safer Internet Day, it's a great moment to consider how legislation and government policy can truly make the internet safer for our children. I'm delighted that we've got a panel of esteemed experts in digital and internet safety, public policy development, and I'm equally delighted that Lord Leslie Griffiths, a trustee of Premier, has agreed to chair this panel discussion. So I'm going to leave it to Lord Leslie to make the formal introductions, but each of the panelists here today have in different ways confronted the challenges of tackling online harms and have each worked to try and make the internet a safer place for our children to be. And this is an opportunity, and we've had some successes today, but it's an opportunity to discuss what kind of difference we can make in the vast landscape of the internet, all 5 million terabytes of it. And Premier Christian Communication is a digital organization. We've embraced the online world. With our digital first policy means that across our platforms, everything is geared to the internet and utilizing it for the benefit of the Christian faith. In fact, our slogan is to help people to put their faith at the heart of daily life and bring Christ to their communities. And the internet, we think, is a key way of doing that. And especially in the last 2 years when the church has been in lockdown, we've seen many, many opportunities to use these platforms for good. So as we all connect on social media, and welcome if you're listening now or watching now or indeed at some future point, hope that this particular time will be of benefit to you. And without further ado, Lord Leslie.
Well, thank you, Peter, and welcome to this discussion, those who are in the room and those who are somewhere. I'm a member of the House of Lords, and I've been here for 17 years. I'm on the Communication and Digital Committee. For a short while, I was on the front bench for a digital agenda, as well as culture, media, and sport. It's my pleasure just to serve here at this moment as a moderator of this immensely talented team. And indeed, I could just give a little thumbnail sketch of each one of them, but I think that since I know that all of them will rise to it, I think that I'm going to ask them to do it for themselves. So we have, just to name them, we have immediately on my left, we have Baroness Kidron, whose prodigious work in the field of filmmaking and social interests and networking, and who constantly is reminding us of our responsibilities in the field of caring for each other and caring particularly for children on the internet. I'm very delighted that Baroness Kidron is here. Welcome, Eben. And next to her is Lord Ed Vaizey, and he was and has been the longest serving DCMS minister and been closely involved with legislation as it has been happening in recent times, and we'll have a vantage point from that angle to say some very interesting things. And so, Ed, lovely to have you with us.
Thank you, Leslie.
And then we have Stephen Kinsella, who's a lawyer. I won't hold that against him. It's very nice to see you, Stephen. And you have founded an organization called Clean Up the Internet. I suppose that explains itself, although I'm hoping that you'll give us a little more enlightenment as things go on. And so welcome to join this little band. So if you don't mind, we have had this startling news today. I think it took a few by surprise. Ed and Eben were on the joint committee whose recommendations were largely taken and made something of, and have produced today's announcements. But here we are on a day like today, and you with your backgrounds and so on, tell us a little bit more about where you focus in these areas and these matters, and a little bit of a response to what's happened today, and then we'll see where we go from there. So let's start with Bevan, shall we?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be on the panel. I am the chair and founder of an organisation called Five Rights Foundation, and we seek to build the digital world children deserve. And that means that we are everywhere at the intersection of childhood and technology, and that is increasingly everywhere. So I'm here in that capacity. I think that also worth saying that in the House, here at the House of Lords, I've done a number of things in this area. I was also on the Communications Committee for many years, where we did a number of reports that in some way lay the ground for some of the legislation that we are now seeing, the groundwork. I was also a member, as you say, of the joint committee that scrutinized the online safety bill. So I actually spent the last quarter of last year taking evidence, hearing what the real problems of real people are in using the internet, and trying then to work out what kind of structures we need to sort of move us from victims to enjoying and benefiting and prospering together in the digital world. And I think that's something I'd like to say at the get-go, which is this is not about slamming the digital world. We heard, that actually it's very useful to your community and was fantastic during lockdown. So what we're talking here is really about product safety. We're talking about creating a world that is fit for purpose, and that is a world in which digital exists. And then finally, I probably should say that I was the instigator behind something called the Age Appropriate Design Code, which is a piece of legislation that we already have, and perhaps we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But I think what's important for your listeners to understand is, no, it's not too late. We can do something. And in a sense, the most important thing about the Age Appropriate Design Code is that we've seen companies, mega companies in Silicon Valley respond to a UK regulatory code on behalf of children. So we can do things, and what's happening now in the UK is terribly important for the whole world. So finally, from me, very interesting announcement this morning. Yes, we did recommend at the Joint Committee, and in fact, I have a private member's bill about age assurance rather than age verification. And again, we can come back to it. But I think we have to understand some of the detail, and a lot of regulation, and certainly digital regulation, is in the detail. And if I can steal something from your community and say, God is in the detail, that's what I want to see about today's announcement.
Yes, I can speak with authority on this. God will not be offended by what you just said. But before we come to Ed, perhaps I'll cross the floor here to Stephen and ask him perhaps to, and certainly you raise questions that we'll be coming back to. So Stephen, just give us a little thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, well, thank you. And again, add my thanks for the invitation. It's obviously very timely and potentially quite an encouraging day if the reports are accurate. As you said, I'm founder of Clean Up the Internet, and we have our own perspective and our own approach to this. I mean, like Five Rights, we have followed a design-led approach to dealing with online harms. We came at this because we were concerned generally about the level of discourse online. So yes, abusive and harmful material, but also disinformation. And research that we commissioned showed that a disproportionate percentage of that material was actually either generated or amplified by anonymous accounts. And also that material was very often targeted at people who clearly did not want to receive it. And so we proposed a three-step solution, which is that the platform should all have to give all of us the right to be verified if we choose to be verified, that then we'd all be able to see who is verified. And that would help us, I think, exercise a bit more judgment as to whether what we were seeing was likely to be true or reliable or not. And finally, that we should all be able to block replies from unverified accounts. But all of this giving the power to the individual user to control what they see online. So we weren't proposing a ban on anonymity. but we were focused on making verification easier and more attractive. And we were comforted in that by a YouGov poll, for instance, that showed, because one of the things you find is we're often told, well, you're introducing friction, people won't welcome this. But in fact, the polling from YouGov showed that 80% of users actually would welcome the ability to be verified and would take that up. So we felt that our focus on verification was actually complementary, at least, to the proposals that Five Rights and others were advancing for the protection of children. We have spent some time looking at solutions to verification, because that's the other thing. Once you get into the detail, how will it actually work? But it's important that I think the solutions be simple, and also that they be privacy respecting, so that what we don't want is to create another trove of data that the platforms can use to monetize and target us with advertising. But we are aware, and I'm not the expert in this field, but we are aware of some third-party solution providers out there. There's Yoti, for instance, who work with the post office. There's a company called OneID, which uses the data that we've already given to our banks. So they can contact the bank and get them, they act as an interface. They will, with the bank data, be able to assure the platform that the person who is looking to create an account is a real person. And of course, the benefit of the bank solution is it doesn't completely deal with it, but it deals largely with some of the concerns about digital exclusion, because of course more than 98% at least of the UK population have bank accounts, and therefore they've already given that data which could be used. And of course we have, as I'm sure, we have faced obviously pushback from the cyber libertarians. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who think that the internet shouldn't be interfered with at all, and they want to push responsibility on us all as individuals for looking after ourselves and for looking after our children. And I'm always struck by this. I remember when I bought my son his first smartphone when he was about 13 or 14, I was very surprised to find that there was no privacy protection on it as standard. It was down to me to go online, find the sites and download pieces of software. And I think, I've just bought a new electric car. If they'd said to me, well, you can get the airbags from somewhere else, and the safety belts, of course, you can go online and get them and fit them yourself, we wouldn't tolerate that in any other product. So we agree with Five Rights entirely that children need a higher level of protection, and that won't be solved by our proposal on its own. What will happen as they get older and graduate towards adults, they will then be able to take more responsibility for looking after themselves, and then the tools that we're advocating, I think, would help them for that. But it comes back to this principle, doesn't it, of safety by design that we're all trying to insist on, that the platforms, and we hope this legislation is going to make them identify the risk factors, and the Ofcom will be given the powers to make them do that and make them come up with appropriate ways to mitigate the harms. We're feeling a bit more optimistic now about the online safety bill, certainly than I was a year ago. I think the reports, from the House of Lords Committee, from the Joint Committee, from the Petitions Committee, all which have consistently been recommending the improvements that we've all been asking for. So I hope we'll see that in the next draft, and we'll be able to get into the detail, and hopefully we'll actually be able to work with these platforms to come up with good practical tools.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I have to say that I'm beginning to get a sense between verification and assurance of some of the detail that perhaps listeners will want us to explain for them. We'll come back to that presently, but Ed, if you don't mind kicking off here.
Well, thanks very much, Leslie. Just to make clear, I wasn't actually on the joint committee. I would love to have been on the joint committee. I am on your committee, the Digital and Communication Select Committee, which has looked at the online safety bill. And I have been in this space really for 16 years. I was appointed as the shadow spokesman by David Cameron in November 2006, just in time for Steve Jobs to launch the iPhone in January 2007. And I can still remember a friend of mine coming back from New York in sort of 2008 holding an iPad as if it was the Holy Grail, another Christian reference. It is amazing, therefore, to reflect on the journey that everyone has been on in terms of how ubiquitous technology has become and the way it affects our lives. And I would echo what Biban said, which is it's never too late. And I have always taken a very simple approach to how you regulate technology. And again, what Stephen said about the cyber libertarians. When I first became a minister, for example, the big debate was about intellectual property protection, because at that time it was the pirate sites ripping off music that were causing sort of all sorts of consternation. In fact, government legislation in that area, which happened at the very end of the Labour government, was designed to effectively criminalise teenagers for downloading music, which was never going to work. And I thought there would be an industry solution, and indeed there was, which was the streaming services allowing people to access free music. But I do take a sort of analog view, and I make no apology for that, which is I took the view that children couldn't access adult content pre the internet because they would have to get to the top shelf and get past the shopkeeper. And I couldn't understand why on earth we weren't trying to look at solutions to stop them accessing adult content on the internet, quite extreme adult content, which anyone can access with zero friction, as it were. So it strikes me as something that we should really lean into. And this debate has been going on for a very long time. And I still vividly remember an MP called Claire Perry, now called Claire O'Neill. At the beginning of her parliamentary career, she got elected in 2010, having an adjournment debate on this. And I had my civil service minister's brief, which was designed to say absolutely nothing. But I agreed with her. And I said, of course, we should be doing something about this. And in fact, David Cameron then asked her to do a report on it. So this debate sort of started, I mean, other people obviously debating it, but it started sort of being engaged with by government, more than 10 years ago. And yet here we are and nothing has happened. The announcement today is interesting. I wonder whether we're simply back to the future because we've been here before. But B-Ban Kidron certainly deserves an enormous amount of credit because, again, rather like the internet, I can still remember as a minister, B-Ban coming to meet me and saying, I'm thinking about setting up this campaign for children's rights on the internet. And I have to say at the beginning, I was extremely skeptical. But B-Ban has obviously, as she has to so many other people, proved me comprehensively wrong and achieved a huge amount. And it's interesting that the minister who Leslie and I have just been hearing at the Communications and Digital Committee praised Baroness Kidron for today's announcement. Said it was the result of her hard work. So she can genuinely take all the credit, and also the age-appropriate design code. And I think what the age-appropriate design code shows, and I've spoken to people, for example, at TikTok, who have changed the way their algorithms and age assurance mechanisms work. And I think what B-Ban says is absolutely right, that you can put forward what people might think as clunky regulation, but the fact is the platforms then have to accommodate it in some shape or form. And of course, because they're global platforms, they don't actually go to the lowest common denominator, they go to the highest common denominator. If we comply with the toughest regulation, we know we can be pretty sure we'll be complying with all the different jurisdictions we operate. The same applies to the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, how you manage data. Now, a lot of people think that is overly prescriptive and clunky, but the fact remains it is also now de facto the gold standard of how companies handle data. And states like California have copied that legislation because it makes their life a lot easier simply to take it off the shelf rather than come up with a new regime. So I think B-Ban is absolutely right, and everyone is right that all is not lost. The other thing I'd say about tech regulation is that don't let the best be the enemy of the good. We talk about how quickly technology changes and you can't possibly regulate it. Well, yes, you can. You can start from base. Nobody expects, if the online safety bill ever emerges and if it's ever passed by Parliament, nobody by any stretch of the imagination expects it to be perfect. But the key point that people must remember is it will be the first time in the UK that the regulator, any regulator, but this regulator, Ofcom, well, I'll leave aside competition issues, but has powers to effectively hold the platforms accountable for the content that they carry. Now, it may well be that for years after this legislation is passed, people will say, such and such a person called me a so-and-so on Twitter. Why hasn't Ofcom, shut it down? It's not going to do that. But for particularly Ofcom's view is for issues like child sex abuse, obviously massively serious, and extremist content, the online safety bill will, for the first time, give them real power and real teeth to hold the platforms accountable for this content. So we are making progress. It's tortuous. It's taking a very, very long time. It depends on amazing campaigners like Stephen and Biban. But this is the direction of travel. And I think it's pretty irreversible. And I completely echo what Stephen said earlier about the cyber libertarians. One constantly had to battle with people saying you can't regulate the internet, you shouldn't regulate the internet. The favorite phrase was always, well, you just don't understand tech. Well, my answer to that is you don't understand the public square. Policymakers are there to synthesize the views of citizens about what should be decent behavior, whether it's online or in the physical public square. And we set out what we think are desirable outcomes, and we put in place regulation. It will require, of course, an ongoing partnership with the technology platforms, but you've got to move and you've got to legislate.
Thank you very much, Ed, and certainly, again, you've set a direction of travel, and like Beeman and Stephen said, the positive things that need to be said, at the same time leaving open areas where perhaps we might want to have a little bit more explanation and sort of a deeper look at the issues. I first became aware of Beeman when the House was discussing the data processing bill, as it then was, where there was a whole, I mean, there were so many mini debates within the big subject, like the freedom of the press, like the protection of children on the internet and so on, and her zeal in the campaign. But that's also where I heard first mention of the Digital Economy Act, part 3 of which sort of is still in abeyance, if it'll ever be resurrected in its original form. But since you were, if I may stay with you for a moment, Ed, help us to understand why all these years later, what seemed to be so sensible as a concluding element within that act, it was decided to shelve it, or was it really to look for a better way of incorporating it in something else subsequently?
Well, I suspect Beeban will actually know better than I do, because I wasn't in the department when this stuff came to a head. Jeremy Wright was the Secretary of State at the time. But let me just speculate before Beeban then gives you the facts, which is a number of points. One is there were a series of kind of elections happening at the time, and also massive punch-ups about Brexit, which was slightly distracting. But so first of all, there is always a political dilemma, which is if you're being warned that your approach could be potentially catastrophic, there's a tendency for politicians to think, well, let's leave that problem to my successor. Delay is quite a good tactic for political self-preservation. There were some legitimate concerns, and I think Beeban here might expand on the difference between verification and assurance. There were concerns that if you effectively ask people to verify their identity to access an adult content site, you were asking them to hand over significant data to sites that perhaps don't, at first blush, strike you as responsible gatekeepers, and that trove of data was then unbelievably vulnerable and also embarrassing, obviously, and whether that could actually work and whether there were legitimate security concerns. But the third point, I think, is sort of goes back to my earlier remarks, which is letting the best be the enemy of the good, the sort of siren call to say, well, let's put this in the online safety bill, give it just another bout of scrutiny to make sure we get it right, make it more coordinated and coherent. And of course, that ends up being an excuse for complete inaction. And actually, the age appropriate design code, because Beeban got it through the Lords, any civil servant would have said, we can't have this now. It's got to be part of a bigger bill and a more comprehensive strategy. This is doing policy piecemeal, but it's already had an impact.
That from someone who watched from the margins and who set up someone who was up to our eyes in it. So what have you got to say to that? And do expect, Stephen, for me to get some comments from you in a moment.
So I think everything that Ed has said is actually correct. I think there's perhaps a couple of additional pieces. I mean, and I am going to absolutely underline his political point, which is actually, I think there's quite a lot of people who have should take a serious look at themselves, who have kicked this down the road and actually not thought about the victims themselves. And the victims, you know, and I work a lot with bereaved parents, and this stuff kills if you don't get it right. So, you know, I am putting a serious note here, but I think that that political football point has been operating, and it's unforgivable. Yeah. On the more sort of, you know, granular thing, I think there are a few things. I'd like to raise the question of lobbying. The tech companies, every single time anything has been invented for the benefit of society, have said it is technically unfeasible. I give you two-factor authentication, which you probably all use today, was going to break the internet. GDPR, which is a global standard, was going to break the internet, age-appropriate design code, and also, of course, age verification. So anything they don't like is going to break the internet. And unfortunately, people in government and in the civil service listen to them. Where I have some sympathy, I recently looked at the tracking of lobbying in the EU at the moment, and the amount of money that the tech companies now put into lobbying is eye-watering. And speaking as someone who has one foot in the legislator and the other foot in a sort of a campaigning thing, we are watching them buy up all the talent out of the third sector, all the expertise, so that now tech lobbying is bigger than the drug companies, is bigger than tobacco, is bigger than the NRA, and is bigger than big food, all of which are renowned for being very, very, very big. Yeah. So I think we have to look at that and say, you know, that this is a David and Goliath. This is David and Goliath here, and those people who are on this side have got a big monster to defeat. So I think that that's one part of why it keeps on getting kicked down the road. I think there was an error because of the lobbying to keep the social media companies out of Part 3, and therefore it was a lot of political capital for a small gain, because most kids are going to get their porn on social media. So you go, oh, we're going to fix this over here, but we're going to leave a big problem here, and we're going to take a big political hit for it. That's not the best equation for any minister. So that was why perhaps it was a better idea to expand it, put it in the bill, but not if you're then going to push that bill down the road. So you know, and I think that to give credit, there were a couple of secretaries of state who did take it seriously, but didn't see the wind coming and all the delays coming, and therefore did the wrong thing in retrospect. And then I think I would also say, I've been in the House not even a decade yet, but I have worked on this tirelessly. I've had certainly 5, possibly 6 secretaries of state in that department. Yes. And every time, this is a complex area of policy, every single time the Secretary of State or the minister understands the issue, they are moved on, and you start back at the beginning. So there's also an absolute lack of understanding in the leadership. And I'm going to pick up one last point, which is to the point that they then made a mistake, which is a mistake that I am concerned government are making again, which is government does not have to set the technical standards. It has to set the outcome that they want, that is correct. Yeah. And that's what we did with the code. And they have raced to innovate with their creativity, with their money, with their talent, with their deep pockets, you know, and they can innovate a good solution to the outcome we want. And what they did with the DEA was get in bed with the porn industry to work out a technical standard that no parent in their right mind is going to trust, because it comes from the porn industry, right? And also all those adult males, whether or not it's a good idea for adult males to consume so much porn, I am not here to judge, but it also made them very nervous, so they then push back. So my point about age assurance, and as you know, Leslie, I've been pushing a private members bill, and this is what I want to see from the government, is I want to see an outcomes-based mandatory code. So it says it must work, it must be secure, It must be private. It must not kick kids out of places on the internet that they actually have a right to be. You know, it must be assume that children don't always tell the truth, you know, etc., etc. A whole host of things that the government insists on, and then let them innovate. Stephen's already talked about some of the companies who are doing this, and I think it is worth saying that the UK has a very sort of hot commercial age check sector. They're very keen on regulation, because then they can say, hey, we meet it.
I don't want to impact on Stephen's time, but this is the key point when I was reading the newspaper reports today. The government just say, make it work, and industry will actually come up with solutions.
Yeah.
Stephen, come on.
Well, to be fair, he was trying. I kept butting in.
I was struck by Ed's expression, about the best being the enemy of the good. And it's true, we always get this pushback. People say, oh, but that won't solve everything. And it is true, obviously, that people using VPNs and others can circumvent some of the measures we're talking about. But we're talking about children, most of whom accidentally stumble across this material. So yes, you know, a very determined 12-year-old, you know, tech savvy one might work. I mean, I don't know about you, but in my household, we rely on our children to run most of the tech in the house for us. The other thing is, we're often told, well, the UK can't do this on its own. We need international cooperation and agreement, which is going to take far too long. The reality is, again, as Ed said, the UK is such a large and significant part of the digital economy that if we make rules, that they will bite and they will be followed. And I agree, it's this highest common denominator approach is likely to be the one that will win out. Lobbying, yes, so we at Clean Up the Internet, we're registered on the Transparency Register with the European Commission as well, and we are lobbying to get similar changes embedded into the Digital Services Act, just as well with online safety. So again, because we were taking that highest common denominator, our feeling, you know, put it very simplistically, we felt we only needed to win in one place. If we could win in the UK or in Brussels or perhaps in Ireland, where a lot of these companies are regulated, then that will be enough, I think, for us. But the UK, I think, is still our best chance at the moment of getting something in quite early. I always smile even when someone says it's a David and Goliath contest, because I remember that David did win, and I think we're winning at the moment. And obviously the announcement today is very encouraging, but we need to keep up the pressure. Definitely those of us who are on this side of the debate. And in particular, I think we need to, one of the things we're going to be working on, as you are, is bringing forward evidence that there really is a public demand for this. We know that there is, but we're going to be working on getting stories, getting case studies showing the need for it.
And Leslie, can I just add to this idea about children lying? I think there's a couple of things that I would really like people to think about. One is, hundreds of thousands of children do lie. They are encouraged to do so by not getting access to services if they don't lie. But millions of children don't lie. And those millions of children are 13 to 17. Yeah, they don't lie, and the companies know how old they are, but they still serve them porn. So I think let's just, first of all, just remember most children are not lying. The second thing is, and again, I mean, Stephen's made the point that actually the majority of porn consumed by children is accidental or unintentional, let's say. So again, you know, let's not have the vision of the little boy who's being naughty here. Yeah, everything shows us that it is much, much more serious and pointed and directed than that, right? And then finally, on this line point, talk to any child development expert, and what they will say is we have inflicted such a travesty on children by normalizing this. If a child gets a VPN, goes around it, finds themselves on a porn site, well, A, that child has learned some technical skills, which is a saleable skill in their later life. But more importantly, they know they are transgressing. They know that what is coming towards them is not what society is saying normally. And I don't want to insult your listeners by saying things that are, you know, crude and rude, but I talk to doctors, I talk to psychiatrists, and I talk to children, and the norms that are being created are hurting them, hurting them physically in ways that are not just unpalatable, they are criminal. Yeah. And so I think, please, let's not blame the kids, and let's talk about norms, and let's put those norms in regulation, that we have outcomes, and then we can start to say, oh, whoops, you've been a naughty child. And that is a parental issue, not a society issue.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now, I've had my right shoulder nudged by Peter. He's a preacher and consequently doesn't like to be left out of the scene for too long. And so it's quite unconstitutional. It wasn't part of the scripted order of things, but I'm going exceptionally, because I'm such a gracious man, to allow him to intervene at this stage.
Well, all I wanted to say was, because I totally agree with you, we campaigned in 2010 when Claire Perry was the minister, and we had the safety net campaign, which we resurrected recently because of how long this has taken to come through. And I remember all those years ago, so 12 years ago, a doctor coming to one of these kind of gatherings and said that if you give a 13-year-old boy access to this stuff, it's like giving them crack cocaine. It becomes very addictive very quickly. And we have just raised a generation of young teenagers who are having incredible problems with making relationships. All of the statistics say that it's hugely damaging. I'm married to a head teacher. She can tell you exactly what it's doing in schools. And this needs to get done and sorted really quick, because the stuff we're harvesting now, I think we haven't even seen what's going to happen down the line. But goodness knows what that lot are going to be like as they try to form families in a decade or so from now. It's really quite worrying.
I remember when, the important point Biban mentioned earlier, that, she'd seen 6 secretaries of state. I think there have been 10 or 11 secretaries of state since I first joined the department in 2010. The key to getting a lot of this legislation done is also number 10. I remember when there was an issue, I dealt a lot, obviously the debate about adult content began when I was a minister, but the issue of child sexual abuse images was obviously hugely important. And David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, said, talked to Google and said, you've got to stop allowing these images to be found when you type in search terms. This also echoes what Biban said about people always claiming it's technically too difficult. And David Cameron said to them, and everyone on the course said, this is impossible. David Cameron said, if you do not do this, I will bring in legislation. Google, I shouldn't laugh about it, very, very serious issue, but Google went from saying, we could probably do 25 search terms to 130,000 search terms, where instead of an image appearing, a notice appeared saying you are searching for illegal content, blah, blah, blah. It can be done if you're prepared to act, but it has to come, you have to have buy-in from number 10. It has to be the Prime Minister on something like this needs to be engaged and supporting the department. Parliamentary time has to be found. There has to be a real lean in to get this legislation across the road.
Well, that's pretty good advice too. Number 10 is very much in our minds just at the moment. But even I know that you've had 2 private members' bills sort of in and out, and one has been about young suicides.
Yeah.
Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I would. And I think that this is something that is one of my anxieties about today's announcement. Pornography is, I think we've established in this group, an extremely important issue, and it must be dealt with. But it is by no means the only issue. And, I've been working with the Molly Rose Foundation with Ian Russell, whose daughter Molly committed suicide, with Frankie Thomas's parents, and with Ollie Stevens' parents. And, when you hear their stories, I don't think there's anything that upsets me more, actually, than hearing the stories of bereaved parents, because some of it is about what happened to the child, but the other bit is the devastation of family, community, school, friendship groups, and a sort of a total lack of trust in the world. Now, in each one of these cases, there was the children were targeted with self-harm material at scale, colossal scale, suicide stories, suggestions that they commit suicide. And one of the things that I found most compelling was that 3 weeks after Molly died, she was still getting suggestions to go to sad sites into her email box because it was automated. So I think as much as it's very difficult for people who are listening in, who are not experts, to sort of get behind a campaign to regulate algorithms, I think that I would ask you to consider that it is actually a basic question of product safety. That actually, if your product cannot be rolled out without eye-watering, sending eye-watering amounts of self-harm, suicide, or indeed racism or attacks on women or so on. If your product, then it's not fit product. Yeah, and I'm like Ed, unapologetic about using sort of these 20th century terms against a 21st century company. And I think that's the other thing, is I would ask listeners to stop thinking about platforms. They're not platforms, they're companies. They're making profit and they are running a business. And so they have to be safe for the users. And so I think that what I would like to see is two things. One is age assurance, by which I mean any system that purports to estimate age or age range. You don't need to give up your passport to actually offer an 8-year-old information in a video instead of instead of a long legal text. You just have to have common sense. So you can roughly find out how old they are and give them information in the right thing. Yeah, age verification means you need an exact age because you need to know they are or are not this particular age. And what I'm asking for is actually for people to really, if they care, to find out, and actually if they are just incensed, to get behind the Joint Committee report and write to their MP and say, actually, we want everything in the Joint Committee report in the bill, otherwise we won't vote for you.
Well, that's an action point, and I think that Premier
Yes.
Radio will
And
be
right to
in a
number
position
10
to
as
do
well.
that.
Yes, and right to number 10. Excellent.
Right to Boris.
Right.
Right to Boris. Did we all hear that?
No,
Do you think
I
about
do think it's
democracy?
really important because politicians do need to know this. They need to know product safety. We want it safe for our kids.
I do think B-Ban should be a consultant to Premier Radio on this campaign, because I do think actually the language, the way she uses language is very, very important. Companies, not platforms, companies making profits, product safety, all these languages.
I think that this is all going to be grist for our mill, not only now as this program goes out, but subsequently as we use the material in other ways. And I think that it would be good for us to remind ourselves of the huge listenership, the huge audience that this station actually has.
How many do you have, Leslie?
So, around about 2.5 million a week across the.
Well, that is
different-
amazing. What amazing reach. And it's a very good example of, so this is the good that technology brings, digital radio. That was one of the things I did get right. And it's provided new content for audiences that are out there, but also it's a privilege to be asked on this panel, but I wonder how many politicians you have, because they probably are completely oblivious to the audience they could reach by talking to.
We're working on it. We are indeed.
But sorry, can
No,
I
no,
just
please,
say,
please,
just
yes.
since we're on the subject of your audience, I do want to say that the faith community have been particularly supportive of me in my various campaigns, both inside the house and outside. And I think that is because ultimately, there is a cost to this. There is a cost. And the tech companies are, overpriced for their safety record. Yeah, there is a cost. And so it is also a moral position. And so I am asking people to really think about that and think about their own usage and think about their children and think about how high up their priorities this issue is, because I think it should be right at the top.
Well, I think that what we've been getting a sense of is that we had a very positive beginning to this discussion, but we haven't wanted to forget the cost or the fact that although we don't want to dwell on victims, there are victims, and that we must try and concentrate on outcomes, that there is a moral dimension to it, and there must be a will to achieve those outcomes. Stephen.
Just a small point. Somebody mentioned, I think Ed mentioned competition law earlier, and it made me reflect on this. So I was a European competition lawyer, and if this were a properly functioning market, we would see the companies compete to offer better privacy and better protection. We don't see that, and I think that that's because there's market failure, and so we need to regulate to give them the incentive to introduce it, because they're not. In fact, if anything, what we're often met with is the argument, well, that's the industry standard. That's how we do things in the industry. We say, well, yes, of course, it's the industry standard. You created it. You created the standard that suits you, that places the least obligations on you. We need to flip that so that they're somehow incentivized to offer us better, safer products rather than the very loose.
We should have had you in the discussion we've been having with the competition people just before this meeting took place, because certainly ways of improving competition and sharpening the products that people put into the marketplace and regulating the whole arena of competitive forces is a very important part of the whole strategy we must evolve. Now, I think that we've got to the bottom of age assurance and age verification. I think that was one of the things I wanted to be sure we got. But you began by saying that we must get into the nitty-gritty of this for the sake of elucidating things that we all need to be able to grasp and get a hold on. Are there any things that have been omitted from what we've discussed thus far?
Well, I think we're doing a very good job, but
it was for me to say that.
No, of covering the ground.
Good.
But I think maybe the thing that we should just absolutely, agree, as a group, that this is technically possible. Yeah, you can have age tokens, you can have AI, you can have capacity testing. There are systems already invented. There are systems this close. I've got something fantastic on my computer which tells my age within 6 months from me saying how now brown cow.
You're kidding me.
No. It's extraordinary voice. And also that you can do selfies, and they are getting so accurate that very soon it will be as accurate as, the mistakes around hard identifiers, given that you don't know that the person actually is related to the identifier. So I think that what we should say is this is not about technology, it's about governance. Yeah, and that there are loads of people. There is, first of all, government saying what the outcome should be. Then there's technology companies actually, doing it. Then there's a regulator checking over it. And then there is parents and children. Yeah. And I think that we mustn't ever pretend that parents and children don't have a role, but we must not responsibilize a group of people who don't have proper choices. So I think that Stephen sort of, alluded to this in the beginning, which is once we've got all the regulation in place, once it's fit for purpose, once we have product safety, then we have to have tools. But you cannot start with tools and responsibilizing parents and children. And I think that is the next trick. After they say, it's technically unfeasible, they then say, okay, we give you tools and you'll do it. And actually, that's never the answer. It has to be by design, by default, their responsibility, somebody up there checking that they're doing it well. And then parents have a very rich role in parenting their children online, just like they do in their families.
Well, now, I think what better way of drawing this to a conclusion than on that note? I mean, the hour has slid.
It has, hasn't it? I was worried we wouldn't have enough to talk about. You could go on for 2 hours.
From the moment you said yes, I knew we'd have enough. So I think that it has been a brilliant discussion. and has hinted at the fact that even when the online safety bill fulfills all our ambitions, desires, and all the rest of it, there will still be more to do. And it might be nice perhaps to think of another panel when the bill has been published, and we can have a think about where it is now and what the next questions are. But to
I'm in.
and to Bevan and to Stephen and to Peter and from me, as Jeremy Paxman would say, it's good night from us and good night to you.
Good night.
Thank you.